Hello, welcome back to my channel, everyone. So today we will be reading Soiled Doves, Prostitution in the Early West. Today we are on Chapter 3, Working Girls, and it's next to the image of Squirrel-Tooth Alice. And I'm seriously thinking it's a ferret on her lap. I'm not too sure, but anyway, let's get into Chapter 3. The red light districts gave little evidence of the romance of the early West. Within those desolate streets where prostitution flourished, there was no silken veil to hide the ugliness of raw, naked vice. Prostitution existed in urban communities, mining camps, logging centers, cow towns, and near the army posts. In these areas, the population was overwhelmingly male. The demand for female contact of an intimate type was so great that the local men carefully guarded their wives and daughters. So the fancy ladies took over. When a soiled dove lost her youthfulness and charms, she started down the steps of prostitution and left the comfort and protection of the parlor house and high-class brothel behind. Many times she was also traded the busier urban area for the more rural communities and frontier towns of the West. If the woman remained in the city, she usually joined the other ladies who worked in the volume brothels and saloons, or became one of the dance halls or hurdy girls. She was still, however, considered to be above the level of the crib prostitutes. The volume brothel catered to a brisk trade and offered no amenities. The furniture was dilapidated, carpets worn, and the shabby bedrooms opened off the hallway into the street. It was set up for business. The woman was required to sit in a tiny cubicle and entice her customers. She usually wore a low-neck, knee-length dress and black silk stockings. It was her job to openly solicit the men who soldered the sidewalks, inspecting the wars of the various women. Her words were often, "Come in, dearie." It was a degrading experience, especially for an ex-parlor house lady. The girls employed in these brothels worked in shifts. They were older, less attractive, and most used drugs or alcohol. It was one way of survival. The madames offered quality, not quantity, and they wanted a quick turnover with a fast profit. The madames wanted quantity, not quality, and they wanted a quick turnover with a fast profit. The men came to the brothel for one reason, and they were in a hurry to get on with it. It was a house without rules, and anything the man wanted he received, even if it was degrading to the woman. A fast prostitute could take care of as many as 25 men or more during her very busy shift. Unlike the parlor house, where the linen was changed after each visit, the volume of brothel seldom bothered to change the sheets at all. It was the type of place where a girl preferred being busy, as it made her time go faster. Since these prostitutes were not respected members of society, they were considered public people. The newspaper enjoyed publishing and enhancing their often sordid stories. These articles provided the local men with a hearty laugh and gave the proper women an opportunity to gather her cloak of respectability around her, secure in her own safe environment. On January 24th, 1891, the Denver Times carried the following news item. "Where is Dirty Alice? Please address all information to Deputy Sheriff James Wilson." Deputy Sheriff James Wilson is very anxious to find Minnie Smith, who is also known as Dirty Alice. Alice is the woman who was recently fined by Justice Palmer for being intoxicated. She promised to bring the money to pay her fine to the courtroom if she was allowed to go home. And as none of her officers cared to be her escort, she was allowed to go. She failed to return, however, and now Mr. Wilson has been deputized to find her and put her in jail. He is not very joyful over the task. There's no escape for these women. If Minnie Smith or Alice had been attempting to change her profession for a better life, the newspaper story most likely would have destroyed any chance she might have had. One such woman tried over and over to leave her unsavory profession. She had learned to be a seamstress and was successfully employed by the trade during her off hours. Due to the continuous newspaper harassment, she finally gave up and left the area, only to continue on as a prostitute. While most of the prostitutes hid their hatred and distaste behind lavish smiles, some of them enjoyed their jobs. There were nymphomaniacs who were so devoted to their profession that they spent their vacations working in other brothels. Many traveled from location to location with guaranteed bookings. A few were so popular the men and the madames advertised their appearances in advance so the girls would have a full schedule when they arrived. These prostitutes seldom left their rooms except to eat. In the larger cities, many of the volume brothels hired their prostitutes by the week. These women were a cut above the norm, and each had been examined by a doctor before seeking employment. They worked for a pimp, who would first take them to the brothel so that the madame could pick who she wanted for the upcoming week. When he returned with the women, they immediately went to work. Their earnings kept for their pimp, who collected both the money and his girls at the end of the week. The women were not allowed to leave the brothel during the week, and the pimp gave them only a small amount of what they had earned. He kept the rest for himself. In return, the pimp took care of their medical expenses, fines, and bailed them out of jail when necessary. Once in a while, he even provided a little love. The love, however, was given only if the woman had a good week. She usually tried very hard to please her pimp, as his love was all she had. If she became pregnant, the woman was on her own. No pimp wanted a woman who couldn't work. Needless to say, the pimp was a very unpopular man who was despised by almost everyone, especially other men. He preyed on lonely, desperate women and managed to establish an emotional bond with them. These women were already unstable and insecure, and often he was the one who had led them into prostitution in the first place. Once they were established in the profession, he sat back and lived off their earnings. Even the small amount of money that the woman received meant little to her. She usually spent it on cheap perfume and lingerie as her needs were few. Although the pimp and the madame both sold flesh and exploited the women, it should be remembered that it was the pimp who seduced the girl into prostitution, alcohol, and drugs, not the madame. The soiled doves in the more rural communities generally enjoyed a measure of respect and greater freedom than the women in the cities. The brothels were smaller, with anywhere from 2 to 7 girls. Its furnishings were shabby but clean, with battered chains, the worn linoleum, and old calendars for wall decorations. These houses did a good business, especially when the rowdy men came roaring into town with their pockets filled with silver dollars. They were whiskey-thirsty and woman-hungry, and ready to spend their money. The customers of the frontier prostitute were mostly laborers, miners, cowboys, and gunslingers. She seldom made the money she could have earned in the city, and it's doubtful that any of her customers were gentlemen of wealth. However, she had a better chance for marriage in the cow towns, where people were more tolerant of others. The men usually called the prostitute by her name. To them, she was a person, not just another female body. More than one of the soiled doves have been known to trade their fancy fingery for a calico house dress and a successful marriage. Historians carefully guide these ladies' names from outsiders, as their descendants are often the leading citizens of today. All of the madames in both urban or rural areas had two things in common. They were constantly on guard for signs of suicide and drunkenness. I feel like that's going to be just another thing that separates the madams from the pimps, is them actually trying to take care of their well-being, at least in like the most basic ways. Even if it's just so they can continue working. They're not working in their worst qualities, I guess. They were constantly on guard for signs of suicide and drunkenness. When the girls became depressed, they would frequently take an overdose of landrum, a form of opium. The madame also had to ensure that the woman did not drink to excess. The customers didn't want an unattractive, drunken prostitute who could not handle her job. No western city or town was complete without its saloons, gambling establishments, and dance halls of hurdy-gurdy houses. The hurdy-gurdy was a form of hand organ with strings, keys, and wooden wheels that produced music with when the handle was turned. It was first used in Europe and became a popular musical instrument in America during the 1800s. The majority of dance halls used these machines for music, and they were called hurdy-gurdy houses, quote unquote. The ladies who worked as dancing partners in a hurdy-gurdy house were called hurdy girls or hurdies. The saloon and hurdy-gurdy houses, try saying that 5 times fast. The saloons and hurdy-gurdy houses were located throughout the western frontier. They were usually long, narrow frame buildings with a bar on one side and a dance floor on the other. A hallway with several small rooms was in the rear. These rooms were rented to the customers who wanted more than a dance, and the hurdy girls who chose to entertain a man after or during working hours. Not all of these girls were prostitutes. Most earned a good salary from dancing and serving drinks. The dance was often free. But the man knew he had to buy both himself and his partner $1 drink after each dance. The girl usually drank cold tea. She didn't want to become intoxicated and lose her ability to follow her partners. A popular hurdy could take the floor with 50 men or more during the evening, which meant she earned at least $50, half of which she gave to her employer. It was a good wage for the era, and unless the girl was greedy, she had no need to use a room. That sounds a little judgmental. A few of the hurdy-gurdy girls worked part-time to supplement their family's income. Others, however, did rent the rooms and entertain customers. The majority of the hurdy girls received more respect than the average prostitute. One of the favorite dance hall girls and entertainers in Dodge City was the beautiful Dora Hand. Dora was an opera star from Boston whose career was marred by tuberculosis. She came to the West hoping the dry air could heal her lungs. Dora entertained the cowboys nightly in the Gray Lady Saloon, where her clear bell-like voice cheered the hearts of all the customers, especially the mayor, James Dog Kelly. The two soon became close friends. Dora not only had a lovely voice, she was also known as an angel of mercy. When her night at Gray Lady ended, Dora would change into a simple Caroline dress and became, quote, Lady Bountiful of Dodge City, end quote. She was never too busy to visit a sick child or feed a hungry family. On Sundays, Dora would lead the members of the congregation in their hymns. She was so loved by the citizens that the respectable women often complained that Dora was interfering with their duties and deeds of mercy. One evening, Jim Kelly became ill and had to have a surgery. In his absence, Dora and another entertainer moved into Kelly's cabin. A few nights later, 2 shot ranges out of the lovely soprano was dead. A man who had a grudge against Kelly had tried to kill him, but instead had accidentally murdered the beloved Dora Hand. When Sheriff Bat Manson and Assistant City Marshal Watt Earp caught the murderer, he was astonished to find that he had killed a lovely lady and not his enemy, Kelly. Dora was given the largest funeral the city had ever witnessed, and the legend of the dance hall singer, who may not have been a pure angel, grows stronger with each passing year. Quote, the social gulf between the first-class courtesan and those who had become dregs of prostitution, it is as great as the gulf between the sheltered woman in her home and the streetwalker. End quote. The next step down the ladder of destruction was that of crib prostitute. Most, but not all, of these fallen women worked for a pimp, and many followed the boom towns of the West. The women in camps or mining towns would set up their business in a row of tents which could easily be taken down when they moved. In the larger cities, they operated out of hovels referred to as a crib. The crib was one of a string of small frame buildings located in the most disreputable section of the red light district, or in an area referred to as the row or the alley. These miserable dwellings were wide enough for a door and 2 small windows. There was a parlor in front and a bedroom in the rear, and a common privy in the back. They were devoid of any comfort and rented for anywhere from 8 to 20 a week in advance. These structures were scantily furnished. The bedroom was just large enough for an iron bed with washstand, kerosene stove, and a woman's small trunk. It always smelled of Lysol or carbolic acid. Quote, the bed itself was dirty and usually rickety and dilapidated. It was covered by coarse sheets and a bright-colored spread, and across the foot of the bed was thrown a piece of red or brown oigalic cloth. This was to protect the spreads being soiled by the boots or shoes of the customers. End quote. Although the men never removed their shoes, they always took off their hats when visiting the lady. No self-respecting prostitute would do business with a customer unless he removed his hat in her presence. Most of the women made a pathetic attempt to give their crib a personal warmth. Each cherished her few possessions and tried to make her dwelling different from the others. There would often be a few pictures of her family or her pimp, and a needlepoint mottos reflecting upon the virtues of motherhood and mortality. She always had her name carved out on the door to let the men know who she was, or perhaps just to let them know she existed. Women who worked in a crib did not sell romance. The man was not allowed to remain unless he paid for the privileges. On payday, all the cribs played to standing room. Only the men complained if the girl spent too much time removing her clothing. On these days, the majority of the women wore very little attire. From dusk to dawn, they labored in their workshops, as the pimps would have the men lined up with their money in one hand and their hat in the other. A fast prostitute could accommodate as many as 80 men a night. They were in and out in a matter of minutes. By this time, the woman was usually desperate. She had sunk to the level where she had no protection and lived a life of social rejection. A fallen woman could never accuse a man of rape, as she had given up that right. In her autobiography, Madeline tells of a visit to the Row in Butte, Montana. Quote, despite my shuddering horror, the sight fascinated even while it repelled me. I was sickened and faint at the horror of it. I drew my skirt back from contact with the poor creatures who represented the seemly sight of prostitution." End quote. Not all the women who worked alone lived in a crib or had a pimp. Some were fortunate enough to make sufficient money to live in their own house or cottage. Julia Butte was one of these women. She kept a fancy cottage on the Row in Virginia City, Nevada. She had become a legend. Julia had traveled through many western towns before she arrived in Virginia City in 1863. Her cottage was located in a prime spot at the end of the row of cribs on the corner of North and D Street. It had lace curtains at the windows, a bushel carpet, and comfortable furniture. Her bedroom was elaborate, for Julia was a popular prostitute who usually chose her own customers and was reputed to receive as much as 1,000 a night for her favors. She was kind and well liked by the miners. Her generosity and donations to charity earned a measure of respect and gratitude. Julia nursed the sick and injured men back to health, fought a smallpox epidemic, fed the poor, and because of her help to the fire department, she became an honorary member of the Virginia City Company No. 1. In 1867, at the age of 35, Julia B. In 1867, at the age of 35, Julia Buette was murdered. She was found strangled, shot, suffocated, and severely beaten. All of her personal possessions were stolen. The male population was shocked, while the respectable women felt that she got what she deserved. Her friends gave Julia the most expensive funeral in the city had ever seen, and all the saloons closed for the first time in their history. Julia was allowed at a Catholic service, but she could not be buried in a consecrated soil due to her profession. Her lonely grave lies about a mile east of the city. Although the plain wooden marker merely says Julia, her good deeds and kindness have become a part of many legends of Virginia City's colorful past. All prostitutes feared an unwanted pregnancy as much as they feared a social disease. When a woman found she had a disease, she could have it treated and return to work in a few weeks. When she became pregnant, it meant a loss of work and the responsibility of raising a child. Prostitutes could not practice the common forms of birth control, abstinence, or withdrawal, as their livelihood depended upon an active sex life. European women used a form of intrauterine device made from beeswax, which formed a cervical cap or pessary. American women did not have access to these devices. Few know of their existence, and most could have afforded them if they had known about them. The majority of the soiled doves ended up with abortionists, who usually did a bad job and left them sterile, or they attempted to abort the child themselves, which often destroyed their reproductive systems. It was also discovered that, quote, regular use of opioids caused disruption or total cessation of menstruation, and it was possible that prostitutes used opioids as a form of birth control, end quote. If the wealthy prostitute did have a child, she would usually place it with a good family and pay for its care. The poorer woman had few choices. She could let a relative adopt it or put it in an orphanage. The other alternative was to attempt to raise the child herself. This, however, was an unfortunate arrangement, as the woman could barely take care of herself, and her own needs. At the bottom of the profession there was the streetwalker, a woman who lived in a gray world of disease, alcohol, and drugs. Her beauty had been replaced with lines of desperation and age, and there was no place for her to go. Not even a pimp would have taken her. She walked the streets desperately looking for a customer, would take any price, even a drink in exchange for her favors. This woman was once sought after, now had to stand alone in the dark. Shadowy doorways, so the men would not be able to see what she looked like. There was no more hope. The next step could only be one thing: suicide. From the parlor house on the top of the profession to the moral and physical decay of the streetwalker, the Western prostitute always walked a lonely path. Although these women were considered immoral, it must be remembered that it was acceptable for a man to visit a prostitute, but the woman was condemned for being one. Next section is suicide by poison. A fallen woman ends her day with morphine. A tumble-down row in West Denver, the scene of squalor and death. West Holiday Street was this afternoon the scene of a suicide, which threw the inhabitants of that part of the city into a frenzy of excitement and caused nearly all the women in the neighborhood to emerge from the humble tenements with line and greater thoroughfare and stand bareheaded with arms akimbo about the waist. Between 12th and 13th Street stands a long row of two-story, very rickety frame tenants, which at one period, a very long lifetime, had had a coat of lime wash smeared over them. The place is inhabited by people, many of them the lowest stripe. Several of the apartments, or more properly speaking, dens of the structure, being occupied by fallen women and low-lived males who consort with them. Chinese laundry shops with bright colored posters covering the window panes of the first floor here and there lend a little relief to the eye and serve to break up momentarily of the repulsive view. About 50 steps from the north corner of the room is a flight of narrow, very dangerous steps leading to the upper story, and further down another light. Today at 2 o'clock, a policeman paced up and down in front of the first entrance, his every move being watched by a curious crowd of hangers about who heard that one of the wretched inmates had committed suicide. I'll show you the text when I'm done reading. The coroner had been called for and soon arrived and proceeded up the stairs. There, in a small room, black with smoke of ages and the air which was overpoweringly unpleasant, lay stretched a dirty bed, a woman dead. Her name was Mrs. Ringer. The story was she had been drinking heavily. Her husband, a Frenchman, and Chiny, had deserted her, and last night she swallowed a big dose of morphine. On the bed, beside the dead woman, lay a terrier, her pet, whining piteously. The remains were taken away for inquest, and the dog followed the undertaker's wagon. The Denver Times, December 15th, 1886. And then it goes on to the hanging of John Mullanian. I will read that next time when I read chapter 4. Sorry, just need to gather myself. Okay. Yeah. The text. So I'm showing you because it's very strange how things like I tried to emphasize to my best the wretched inmates here, things like that were in all caps and things. I'm wondering if it's like a form of poetry or just because that's how the newspaper was back then. I'm not sure. But yes, before chapter 4, next video, I will read The Hanging of John Mullanian, and we'll look over some pictures, and the sheriff office in Bower County. And then will be chapter 4, which is the love story of Lodi Joel. All right, put a bookmark in for now. Okay, if you found this interesting, please let me know in the comments down below. Please like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the little bell notification. All right, thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye.